Good afternoon. I'm Charlie Erwin, and testimony and then elder. So I grew up here in Fort Worth. Growing up, neither one of my parents were saved. In sixth grade, fifth or sixth grade, my father was saved, and they met through some unsavory circumstances, and that's really characterized their life. All my father wanted to do was be in a punk rock band. And it's actually one of his old punk rock band buddies that invited him to Christ Chapel where he heard the gospel. And so my father becomes a believer, and I'm in sixth grade, about a year after he became a believer. I'm in sixth grade. It's time for me to go to the University Christian Church disciples class, because that's my great somebody was one of the founding members of UCC, and that's what we do in our family. When you're in sixth grade, you go and you become a Christian. You go and you get baptized on Palm Sunday. So I'm all right, Mom. So I start going to that, and at the same time, my father's living in North Richland Hills. They'd been divorced for 4 or 5 years at that point. And my father's living in North Richland Hills. And as I'm walking through this process at UCC, he starts sharing the gospel with me. And I remember we went on this retreat with the youth group over there, and I don't remember where we went. But I remember they sent us off to go have a quiet time and to write a letter. I don't know where this letter is anymore, and I'm not really sure what I put into it, but what I remember was reflecting on the gospel, reflecting on what we had loosely been talking about in this youth group, but mostly with what my father had been sharing with me. So I got back, and that Thursday night that I saw him, or that next weekend that I saw him, he and I started talking about the gospel, and because I brought it up with him. I said, well, why don't we go, if you're really interested, you can go talk to Ted about this a little more. This is Ted Kitchens, pastor. Really focused on that. And I lived here in Fort Worth with my mother and my stepfather, and wasn't the most wholesome relationship, and wasn't the safest relationship. And I would see my father every other weekend and on Thursdays. So like many other high school kids, I start twisting off, and I start looking for purpose. And my purpose was, I want to be the coolest, most partying guy in this school, because I bought into that lie that was valuable, and I did that for really my freshman year, and then coming into my sophomore year, I remember I had a bunch of my buddies over the night before 2 days started for football, and we got drunk, and that next day I was at 2 days. I felt terrible. I was kind of bragging to some of the other guys on the football team, and they said, "You are an idiot. What are you doing?" And as a couple believers that were on the football team with me that were upperclassmen, I was really shocked. Really thought they would have thought my lifestyle was really cool, and they thought I was a real fool. And that was a shock to me. And they also started FCA that year at Paschal. So I started going to FCA, and those guys started to pour into my life. There's another guy that had come to Paschal, and he was at Christ Chapel. And I had been going to Christ Chapel, their youth, when I was with my dad every other weekend through middle school. But then I fell away from that. I wasn't going to UCC, even though I lived 3 blocks away. I just wasn't really connected or plugged in anywhere. I would make coarse jokes, and my father he'd admonish me when I was around him, or when his friends say, "Hey, Vic, you should have heard this great joke your son told me." But I really didn't have I wasn't being discipled. So there's this kid a couple years younger than me that ran into me at FCA, and we got to know each other. He said, "Hey, you need to come back to youth at Christ Chapel. We've got this new guy. He's a young life leader, or he was a young life leader. His name is David Phillips. Great guy, and he's really put this injection into the youth there at Christ Chapel. You need to come." So at that same time, I was also being ministered to by a young life leader. Young life was real big for me at Paschal. Initially, it was because that's where all the hot girls went. And I wanted to go there on Monday nights and see all these really pretty girls. I wanted them to know me. But then those young life leaders, they'd come to Paschal, and there's a guy named Ward Nicor. And if you've ever met Ward, you can't miss him because he's about 6'5" or 6", skinny as a rail. He played basketball at TCU for a little bit. But my sophomore year, he moved in down the street. He married a sweetheart that he met when he was working at Kanakuk, and they lived 3 houses down from me in somebody's garage apartment. And so Ward would come house sit for us because around that same time, my mother's second marriage was falling apart, and she was flying different places, and Ward was our adult supervision. And so my young life leader would come live at my house and stay with us, and even though his wife was only 3 houses down, he would ask me those hard questions, and he would hold me accountable. And at that same time there at Christ Chapel, great guy that's here in town still, Greg Love, he's an attorney here in town. He was my Bible study leader. And Greg will ask you some hard questions. I mean, he still asks me hard questions, but those are relationships that with Greg and with Ward and Dave Phillips and Ryan McCarthy, who's still at Christ Chapel. Dave passed away about 11 years ago. Just those guys started just pouring into me, and they earned that right to be heard with me, which is a big part of what Young Life does. It's a bunch of folks that go into these high school campuses, and they earn the right to be heard with these kids, and then they share the gospel with them. And those guys had either been in Young Life or they were still in Young Life, and they were doing that with me. So my senior year of high school, my father, who's just become this rock, he's had this amazing conversion experience. Even though he still has some of that sin and the consequences of that he had his baggage. His conversion was great, and he was learning, and he was in the Word, and he was teaching, and then he and my stepmother separate, and his life just gets shattered, and he actually moves back into the house over here close to TCU. And so first time since I was 5 years old, my mother and my father are living in the same house. My mother's seeing another guy. She's already divorced my stepfather, but my father needed a place to come, so he's sleeping in the sunroom. And it's kind of neat, but it's also a huge mess. I mean, my father is an emotional mess. My mother's seeing this other guy. They're going to Hawaii. They've got this place they're building there and this place in Destin. And I'm a senior in high school. I think I'm going to go to Texas A&M, but this guy talks to me about West Point. That seems like a great opportunity to get out of Dodge. And it was. I mean, it was such a blessing that I had that opportunity to go up to West Point, because during that time, my life here in Fort Worth was just unraveling. My family was just spiraling out of control. My mother went and got married on April Fool's Day of my senior year of high school in Las Vegas. It was the last thing I thought was going to happen, but she asked me that morning, guess where Gerald and I are going today? I said, you and Gerald are going to go get married in Vegas. I said it flippantly because I was trying to cram for a test, and it was the last thing I thought would actually happen, but that's what they did. But that same day I came home from school and I had my acceptance letter from West Point. I mean, it was divine. God was getting me out of this situation because at the time I felt that this was mine to fix. My mother's problems are mine to fix. My father's problems are mine to fix. My sister, who's 2 years younger, who is spinning off and out of control, is mine to fix. I didn't know what to think of my siblings that were 12 years younger than me, from both my mother and father. That was beyond me, but God plucked me out of Fort Worth, and he put me up in New York. So I was in school in New York for 4 years, and I got away from my network of believers that were at Christ Chapel, because at that time I was really involved with the youth. I was really involved with those young life leaders and the leaders that were at Christ Chapel, those youth leaders. And I was in my Bible study with Greg Love and another guy, Noel Bertilla. And I mean, I had a great network. And then, like so many other college kids that go away, and that's not there, I wasn't actively looking for that next network. And what I found up there was the rugby team. And I was a typical idiot rugby player. I mean, I kind of fell back into the things that I thought were cool when I was a freshman, sophomore in high school. And I did that for a couple years there at West Point. And during that time, I came home and I noticed my wife. She had come home from school, and I started thinking about the kind of man I'd like to be for her. And then God also he just humbled me. He literally kicked me in the head. I ended up, between my freshman year at West Point and my junior year at West Point, I got 6 different concussions. I separated a shoulder. I got some other injuries. And that was it. I was done with rugby. And it got me, I still have those guys that are my buddies and that I went to war with. But God, I was told that if I got another concussion, I wouldn't get my commission. 9/11 had happened, and I wanted to be an infantry officer. And I didn't want to lose my opportunity for a commission in the United States Army. So that was it. I even remember saying, God, if I get one more concussion, I'll stop playing rugby. And what did I do? I got knocked out during a game. I was like, well, that one wasn't too big. And then the next game I played, I got injured really badly. And that was it. I knew that was it. And so I'd met someone at school that summer before who said, like, hey, Charlie, you need to come to this Bible study with me. And during that time, during that same period, Greg Love, back here in Fort Worth, he'd see me and he'd call me and he'd ask me, what am I studying? And I'd try to push him off. I'd try to give him the answer. Like many of you who have had children in college or high school that are kind of turning away, they tell you the answer they want you to hear. And you can see through it. And I knew that Greg could see through it. But I'd still try to tell him that answer. But then I get hurt. I'm done with the rugby team. I'm not traveling with those guys anymore. I'm not doing that same stupid stuff. And I get invited to this Bible study. And around that same time, I start dating Jamie, my wife. She's at Arkansas. I'm in New York. We're trying to make that work long distance. And then I graduate and I go off to war. I spent a year at Fort Benning, Georgia. Jamie's still at Arkansas. And during this next 5 years, I go to Iraq twice. So I go to war twice. I get married. And I feel like during that period, I know who my Savior is, and that gives me confidence. I spoke about that a little bit on Veterans Day. Like, I knew if something happened to me, where I would be. And I feel like that confidence allowed me to do my job as an infantry officer so much better. And to also be a light for those guys. But I wasn't in the Word. I wasn't just seeking God's truths, and I wasn't really trying to feed myself. I was just trying to survive. I was just trying to get ready for that next deployment, deploy, make it, bring my guys back, and then get back to my wife. So in 2008, I come back from Iraq, and I was trying to figure out, and I knew I was going to get out of the Army because Jamie was getting ready to go to residency, and we didn't know where we were going to end up for residency. She's OBGYN, and I was trying to figure out, what am I going to do when I grow up? Here I am, I'm 27, 28. What am I going to do? I thought I was going to medical school, but for a whole nother story, that wasn't going to be the case. Well, we ended up in Birmingham, Alabama, and we ended up at this great community church, and Redeemer Community Church. It was in our neighborhood, and it was just divine appointments that took us to that church. We went to another church, and it was the college pastor's last day, and it was his last sermon. And he was going, and I was like, that's too bad, because this is a great message, and he's gone. This is the last I'll ever see him. But it turns out he's going to plant a church in my neighborhood. So it was a blessing. We went to this church. There were 60 people in it in 2008, and then around 2012, we had maybe doubled in size, but we're a really tight community. We started being community with one another, and that was really an opportunity as an adult to really be able to get into the Word with other folks. 2012, we moved back here. We don't know where we're going to go to church. Jamie grew up here at Travis. I've told you background of my parents. They certainly weren't Baptist. I didn't grow up Baptist. I didn't go to a Baptist church. I went to Christ Chapel, so I thought, well, let's try out Christ Chapel. Let's try out McKinney, Doxology now. Let's try Travis. And we came to Travis, and we never went anywhere else. The folks that were here at Travis that I met, they knew me even though I didn't know them. They knew my story with Jamie, having been in the Army, been in Iraq, having been in Alabama. It's like coming home to family that I didn't know, these cousins that I may have never known, but that's what Travis was. And so that first fall we're back, a guy named Nathan Kavanaugh, great guy here in church. He's like, hey, what are you doing Monday night? I'm like, dude, I don't know. I'm probably driving back from Dallas. I was working in Dallas at the time. He goes, you need to come to Bible study fellowship. It's like, what is that? And so he tells me, and Matthew McDonald says you should invite the worst guy you know. So maybe I was the worst guy that Nathan knew. But we go to Broadway Baptist because that's where BSF was held at the time, and it was incredible. It was being fed, and then we end up in the Jones class, and by the way, Randy's a BSF small group leader, and I know where he got his teaching style now. But we go to the Jones class, so I'm being fed by Randy and Cindy, being fed. That first year we studied Genesis, and I see, God's truths, they're as true as they were then as they are now, as they will be tomorrow. And so I've been with BSF since we moved back. And the year after, I was blessed to be called into leadership. So I had a men's group that next year. And for some wild reason, I went and told one of our children's teaching leaders, said, "Hey, we're needing some leaders." And I went up afterwards and I asked Scott. I was like, "Hey, Scott," and I wasn't really thinking about BSF at the time because I was involved. We had this kind of call the wild, or some people here called it the Wild Man Ministry, and we were putting on these banquets here. And I had gotten involved with that. My father-in-law, it's like, "Charlie, you need to get involved with something. Come be part of this." That ministry was doing some good things. We lacked a little focus, but one of the benefits of that ministry was that we got introduced to this hunting ministry out of Houston, where you take these deserving youth, these kids, and we kind of give them a mountaintop experience. It's not dissimilar to taking a kid to camp at Young Life, but we give them this mountaintop weekend And then we share the gospel with them if they need the gospel. If they've already heard the gospel, then we start challenging them. Where are you in your faith? What are you doing? What are you reading? Start asking those hard questions. So I go up to Scott Bevere and I say, Scott, I'm part of this other ministry. I'd really like to come sit in with you or bring my whole class down and let's talk about, what y'all are teaching in this children's ministry, because we need to equip our hunting guides, our spiritual guides, with this similar information. Well, before I know it, I'm a children's leader at BSF, and I feel like, I'm learning, I'm doing homiletics, and I'm preparing lessons, and I feel like that's where God has really grabbed a hold of me as I was preparing those lessons. Kind of like what Dane said with you get more, he thinks he got more out of preparing those lessons for those kids than they got. I feel the same way about preparing those lessons for children's. Even though we might only have one kid or 3 kids on a given week, it's still so worth it. And it's still wonderful because it's God's truth. I mentioned Ron Lee earlier this morning. He's on the Thursday night men's BSF class over at Arbelon. He's our children's teaching leader. So he kind of shepherds the other children's leaders. And that's one of the big takeaways he wants us to be able to equip those kids with, is to know God, to love God, to enjoy God, and to glorify God. So that kind of brings us up to present day. One of the things I left out was when I was getting out of the Army, I was trying to figure out what do I need to do for God to use me? Because I thought I was going to go to medical school. And then I was like, well, maybe this engineering thing or construction management. You know what? I'll become a civil engineer. That way I can design wells and find out where the water wells need to be. And my wife's going to be a doctor. And we'll go be Uber missionaries. And we'll take water to the world and she'll treat everything. And I remember Jamie's cousin said, Charlie, why do you have to go to Africa to do that? Why can't you do that right here? I was like, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. 8 years later, I remember those words, and I've gone back to school and I picked up these degrees because I'm going to be a construction manager, but I really need this engineering license for God to use me. I really need this for God to use me. I really need this for God to use me. And that, I was so wrong. God doesn't need me to do anything to use me. And I would say it's similar to serving in the church. God doesn't need us to go get an MDiv to serve right now. God doesn't need me to have picked up any of my degrees to serve right now. God will equip each one of us to serve as He wills it. And so one of the things that we've tried to teach the kids in BSF is to know God, know who He is so they can praise Him. Know who He is so they can know His voice, know His will. They need to love Him. They need to enjoy Him. And then in the end, they'll glorify Him. I mean, that's what they're going to do. And that they don't have to do anything other than be present for Him. He will come to them just like He'll come to me. He can use a knucklehead like me because I am a knucklehead. Last week we were at, Jamie was the camp doctor at a Young Life ski trip up in Colorado. So every night we'd go to club, or before chow we'd see there are 300 high school kids, and they're acting like idiots. I mean, they're jumping around just acting like fools. And Jamie looks at me and he goes, "That was you." And she said that all week long. She'd see these kids acting like fools all week long, and that was me. And God speaks into their life. And that night when they got in the club and they sing all the songs and the old songs and the new songs, and then a bunch of kids who The guys are there for the girls are there for the guys, or they're there because it's a ski trip, whatever it is, they got there. God got them there, but they're all seated. They're all listening to this speaker share the gospel with them, give them the crosstalk. And God can use us. He can use guys like me. He can use guys like these gentlemen. Whether we're elders or not, God can use us. And so that's, in my testimony, that's one of the biggest things I feel like I've learned in the last probably 4 or 5 years, is that God doesn't need me to be an associate or a principal at Freeze and Nichols. He doesn't need me to be a children's leader at BSF or or a hunting guide for this other ministry. God doesn't necessarily need me to be an elder at Travis. He can use me wherever I am. And as an elder, though, if I am appointed, I want to, with the rest of our church, we need to equip our people to know that same truth, to know that God can use them where they are. And that's that challenge I asked in the second service. I didn't think to ask it in the first service. Like, ask God, where can you serve this week? Who is it? Is it your neighbor? Is it one of your own children? How can you serve? So when a buddy of mine said, "Hey, I'm nominating you for an elder," I thought, interesting. I don't know if I'm not the Baptist candidate. I didn't grow up Baptist, and I certainly don't hold tightly to a lot of the Baptist traditions because they're foreign to me. And I remember asking my wife and a couple other folks, like, what are we doing? Why are we doing this? But I am a candidate who is about God being truth, who is about our Father, the Redeemer, and I'm the candidate who's also going to support a church that is going not only just evangelizing to make new disciples, but in the process of discipling. We've got to build them up. We've got to teach them. We've got to equip them so they can go do it themselves and replicate this, but we've got to teach them.